This episode of PharmacyToDose, the Critical Care Podcast, is proudly sponsored by Chiesi. Chiesi is a family-owned, research-focused, sustainable pharmaceutical company accredited with both B Corp and a benefit corporation status. Chiesi is making global changes that benefits patients, providers, and healthcare organizations with forward-looking and impactful initiatives. Chiesi appreciates the integral role that clinical pharmacists play in patient care and are proud to support this community. To learn more, visit chiesi.pharmacytodose.com. Again, that's chiesi.pharmacytodose.com. The Critical Care PRN is dedicated to fostering the role of critical care pharmacists as essential members of the multidisciplinary patient care team. The Critical Care PRN's goal is to optimize drug therapy outcomes by promoting excellence and innovation in clinical pharmacy practice, research, and education. For more information, including how to become a member, go to critprn.accp.com. Again, that website is critprn.accp.com. Welcome to PharmacyToDose, the Critical Care Podcast, a partner of the ACCP Critical Care PRN. And I'm your host, Nick Peters. Wherever you are and whoever you are listening, thank you. So we had a rapid reaction to the ANNEXa-I trial, about a 30-minute solo pod released in mid-May. But obviously, there's a lot to comb through in this study, a lot to do a deep dive on. And so that's exactly what this two-part episode series is, a deep dive into the ANNEXa-I trial. So very lucky to be joined by recurring guests, friends of the pod. You should all know them from this space, Brian Gilbert and Scott Dietrich. And then, of course, our favorite stats guest expert for the pod, Todd Miano. And so we're going to break this up into part one and part two. So part one is going to talk about a little bit about the study background and then kind of diving into discussions about the efficacy. And then the episode ends with Todd kind of having a cameo or special guest appearance, highlighting some of the most burning statistical and methodologic questions. I think that's going to be one of the best parts. I think a lot of us are reading the studies and inferring one way or the other, and Todd has some really great breakdown and answers to some of those thoughts. So a couple follow-up points. First ever video YouTube episode for This Is Live for the ANNEXa-I deep dive. It's a perfect companion. I'm an audio listener, so if you're listening to this audio, right, I appreciate you, love you. But if you're looking for a little more, feel free. The video is amazing on the YouTube channel. And then part two coming very shortly, if not tonight, first thing tomorrow. So we'll be able to kind of have both of those and do a really big deep dive into, with part two, kind of talking about safety and practical application. But enough talk about Andexanet Alpha and ANNEXa-I. Let's get into our deep dive episode right now. Well, there was so much going on with this trial. Did a quick overview, but now bringing on the experts, recurring guests, friends of the pod to come back and do a deep dive into Andexanet Alpha and the ANNEXa-I study. Brian Gilbert, Scott Dietrich, Todd Miano. So Brian is an emergency medicine pharmacist at Wesley Medical Center at Gilbert PharmD. Scott, emergency medicine pharmacist with UC Health at Fort Collins, Colorado, the appropriately named at PCC_PharmD. And then Todd, critical care pharmacist and assistant professor of epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania at Miano 81. Refreshing. You get these young kids on here, man. They don't have any of the Twitter handles or anything like that anymore. Refreshing to get some familiar faces on here. So Brian, Scott, Todd, how's everyone doing today?
Thanks for having me, Nick. Yeah, no, I've got Twitter handle envy of Scott's his handle. It's probably the best out there on Twitter.
I know you're getting offered cash for that right now, Scott.
No offers yet, but I'm open.
I have the least original Twitter handle ever. It's my name. I was born in 1981. That's it.
So that, like, 81, was that like your... Well, they wouldn't have had... Did they have when you were like on AIM or AOL Instant Messenger, was like Miano 81? I gotta imagine 81 was the number you used at the end of those, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but you're right. Like I am from like the dinosaur days where I can remember having a modem and yeah, AOL online.
Hey,
yeah.
I'm an 80s baby. Hey, come on now, raise them up. But we're not that old. We need to chant it. We're not that old.
Tell that to my back.
Oh, I slept wrong on my shoulder. It's hurting for 2 days. I know. Old guys yelling at clouds now is what this has turned into. Okay, so for those, I'm going to do a brief highlight of the ANNEXa-I trial, but obviously if you want more info, had about a 30-minute one doing a deep dive kind of into some of the stats and things. This one will be a little deeper, but if you want more of an overview. So briefly, the ANNEXa-I International Prospective Multicenter Unblinded RCT, it enrolled adult patients with an ICH prescribed factor Xa inhibitor anticoagulant, received their last dose 15 hours pre-randomization. 18 hours was the cutoff in the ANNEXa-4 study, presenting within 6 hours or less of symptom onset. So key exclusion criteria, GCS less than 7, surgery planned within 12 hours, or a thrombotic event 2 weeks pre-enrollment, randomized 1-to-1 to andexanet alpha or usual care. Usual care meaning you could do whatever you want. About 86% of patients got PCC, but there was, in the discussion from the authors, with there being no international standard of care, they didn't think they had to mandate one process in the usual care arm versus another. So, the primary composite endpoint, a hemostatic efficacy at 12 hours, defined as 3 different things: the change in hematoma volume of less than 35%, an increase in NIHSS score of less than 7 points, and no rescue therapies to decompress the hematoma, whether that's like a surgery rescue therapy or like hemostatic pharmacotherapy. So the study stopped for efficacy at the interim analysis with the first 452 patients enrolled. So you'll see the primary efficacy population. That's what that refers to. And then the entire 530 patient cohort used for safety analysis. So as they stopped for the interim analysis, patients are still getting enrolled. That's where that 530 comes in. So 228 usual care, 224 andexanet alpha, and andexanet alpha associated with a significant improvement in hemostatic efficacy, 67 versus 53% to usual care, driven by a change in hematoma volume. Now, andexanet alpha will also significantly associate with an increase in thrombotic events, significant increase in acute ischemic stroke, numerical increase in myocardial infarction. You'll see everywhere, not powered to detect a difference in MRS or mortality. All right, everyone's on the same page. I think we have to start with this. Why is this topic, the use of andexanet alpha for anticoagulation reversal, and you'd say the ANNEXa-I study itself, why is this so polarizing?
I've been trying to wrap my head around this, Nick, and what I have come up with is essentially this is the movie that you walk out of and you're not sure how you feel about it. And then it comes on TBS or TNT like 5 years later and you give it a watch and you're like, I don't remember feeling that way about this. And I feel like that's what's going to happen is people have such polarized feelings on this, and sort of that ideal of what a patient that comes in and is in this cohort and how they manage it now. And so we're sort of clinging to our biases a bit and what we feel, whether or not we want the shiny new toy or if we want to cling on to something that's familiar.
The biases people had going into the fact before this even come out, and they, soft launched the results a year ago telling us it's better. And then there's like radio silence for a year after that. So that always, perks up people's ears. Is there something shady going on? And then, the results finally come out and then they are what they are and everyone's going to, pick a side and then go from there.
I think that we've learned we've got lots of experience like being burned, especially in critical care, right? The intensive insulin study comes out and we totally change our practice. And then we realize, well, maybe we should have waited and been a little more circumspect. Activated protein C, same story there, right? Like that. There are lots of those stories in critical care. So I think we tend to, we've been conditioned to be even more skeptical now than maybe we have been in the past.
And if we're playing skeptic bingo, right, this is hitting all the boxes. Stopped early for efficacy, some signals of harm, questionable, possibly questionable methodologic changes. I reached out to tons of people before this episode because we're going to work on really giving you what we think is the unbiased true feelings. And one of the things that someone said is, man, they made the mistake of putting the PharmDs against them. They rolled this out. They didn't have any data to support it. It was really high cost. And I said on the other one, it really feels like this study is just putting people into their corners because it's a balance of, it's hard to argue improved efficacy. That's been pretty clear, but you have decreased safety, right? That's a balance. Now, this was a FDA mandated study, right? So the previous Andexanet alpha, they used the surrogate of factor 10A levels. You may be wondering, like, why would they do that? Well, look at the idarucizumab approval study if you want to see probably why they did that, because other things they've done that in the past. Well, the FDA was saying that's probably not a reasonable surrogate outcome. You need to create this study, and that's why we're here, right? But now I think the question is, what happens with these harm signals? Like, is this going to be the only mandated study, right? Or do you guys think there's going to be more to come?
I don't know.
That was it.
I mean, you can go both ways. If they're just trying to show the FDA that this drug is effective, they can say it's safe in terms of, they didn't show any difference in outcomes from a MRS standpoint. Yeah, there's some signal in the itemized adverse events, but like if the FDA mandated this one study, they did it. I don't know if the FDA is going to come back and say, oh, you need to do another one just from, they've already done the one. They're going to say this is probably okay.
So in general, like the first mandate of the FDA is to establish efficacy. So like that's the primary, in terms of when they specify design of phase 3 trials, the first mandate is to establish efficacy. And then if there are safety concerns, some of that will be shifted to like post-marketing. So maybe they mandate additional post-marketing studies that might be observational, where they have to have a registry or something of that nature. But I think I tend to agree that this is not going to change any approval status. I think this is they've established efficacy as you said.
Yeah, I think this is it too. I agree with both of them. I think they're going to be happy. At least AstraZeneca is going to be happy to let people like our colleagues, Dr. Caitlin Brown and Dr. Paul Bilbish, do their work and continue to publish those observational data sets and let people decide from there. But I think that AstraZeneca has purchased it from multiple subsidiaries and has just said, this was it. This was the big finale for them when it came to the quote-unquote rollout of ANNEXA-I.
In their defense, this is the highest quality study looking at anticoag reversal in terms of it being prospective randomized. You're looking at we are looking at maybe not the highest level of outcomes, right? But looking at hematoma expansion and not like just factor 10A or, dilute thrombin time levels or things like that. But it was, it's strange. You mentioned that they're going to have database. I think they're already doing that, right? They're having secondary analyses. They had three published before the ANNEXa-I publication was even out. 2 of them at ESOC, right? Comparing the consequences of hematoma expansion and VTE, or predicting who can get a VTE from them. Slow rollout, increased marketing, and I think that kind of goes to the side of us feeling a little scarred. It's like, we've been here. We remember, remember Lilly, shout out Indianapolis, right? But all that with Zygris and things, I think all of us, guard up a little bit. Now, the other thing, I reached out to a few MSLs that work for AstraZeneca, and I told them, I said, sometimes it feels like there's just a lack of full transparency. I did find out something interesting from 2 kind of independent sources, that not only does AstraZeneca not own this data set, Portola, like the old company, they don't own it. It was one individual who owned it that supposedly just passed away. And essentially what that meant was anytime they wanted to publish or they wanted to include something, they had to ask for permission. I don't know what that looked like. I don't know what they had to look at, but that obviously changes things when you think about lack of full transparency in a sense, because it's maybe not necessarily AstraZeneca's, true wish that this was happening. It's kind of what they're stuck with, it feels like. So that was interesting as we kind of think about that. I've never heard of anything like that. It's probably a fairly valuable data set, though, when you think about it.
Yeah, it was the primary investigator, Dr. Connolly, who just passed away. So rest in peace.
R.I.P.
Certainly, everybody has their feelings about this trial and the data set, but certainly when it comes to the heart of it and knowing that there was a person involved, spending his last little bit on Earth, trying to get this out is remarkable. But for me, when I heard that, because I heard it at ASHP Futures last week. That was kind of an interesting fact of this guy owns the data. Like, is there, who is evaluating this? Is there any sort of quality assurance with that? So it's kind of, it raises flags again, not to be the conspiracy theorist pharmacist, but, I'll gladly wear my tinfoil hat for that.
I was going to say, put your foil away. If it wasn't so expensive, do you think we would even be having discussions like this, dissecting every little thing?
I think we would. Hopefully we're rational people. If it was the same cost or less than PCC we would still look at the efficacy data, still look at the safety data, and try and come up with an idea from there. But, Portola rolling this out and costing $50,000, like more than double the dose of the PCC dose, like that's just going to set everyone in the wrong kind of camp from the get-go. And then AstraZeneca has to do a lot of digging to make up that ill will that Portola did when they came out with this drug that, so many years ago.
Yeah, it does feel like, this went from, it was Alexion initially, then it was Portola, then AstraZeneca. It feels like a little mismanaged, right? You almost think of like the sports analogy, like the quarterback getting drafted to the wrong team. It's kind of what this feels like. And you wonder if they would have had maybe different resources or different ideas from the beginning, what that would look like. Have they put any like cost analyses out or anything? Because obviously the big thing is that to acknowledge that the cost has been dropped by about 50% or so. And that has happened, but have they done any, I'm waiting for those to happen to show like, by giving this, you save this much downstream.
Yeah, so they as an AstraZeneca referenced this poster that was presented at ASHP in 2020. So that was a COVID year, so this was like an e-presentation, but they did this budget analysis where they looked at the total cost of the hospitalization, the ANNEXa arm, the PCC arm, and they showed that there was about a $5,000 reduction in total costs with ANNEXa compared to PCC. And that's mostly because they said the outcomes are better, the length of stay is better, the ICU length of stay is shorter. So in that point, you're going to save about $5,000. But what they don't really say after that is when they look at the inputs of how they got those numbers, it's really, really bad in terms of, it's everything is best case for ANNEXa, everything is worst case for PCC. Like the mortality they put in there was like 15% for ANNEXa and like 50% for PCC, which we know is not even close to accurate at all. So if you're actually using real world, more recent data, put that in there, there's no way that analysis holds up anymore.
Yeah, it sounds like that analysis would not hold up with the trial results that we're discussing, right? I don't know that there's any signal of cost. Do they report on length of stay and those types of metrics in this trial? I didn't see those, so I'm wondering. It probably doesn't support. It doesn't support that analysis that you just discussed.
And for this cohort too, it's a different type of outcome. Like, a length of stay for a bad head bleed is certainly, like, depending on your resources and ability to get them to a rehab center, which is obviously what they need post acute injury. Now you're dealing with a lot of centers that may have funding issues or insurance issues and so things like that. For me personally, that type of length of stay when you're talking about cost and that, it's sort of a drop in the bucket of the initial agent you use, even if it is extremely expensive, one way or another. Just my opinion.
I don't think we're good at doing those cost analyses, and having one department pay something higher that downstream helps the hospital in general, but another, like, it's just not like we're not streamlined, I don't think, to truly do those analyses in an effective way. Because if we started using all these and length of stay goes down, that's great. But all of us have been in those meetings where it's like, okay, what can we do to reduce our budget? What can we do? Like, that's in direct conflict with that. So I kind of see both sides of those. We talked about.
I'll do the data analysis after they get a stroke from.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about a unique management strategy if that does happen. We'll highlight that a little bit later. Now, into the primary outcome, right? Hemostatic efficacy versus MRS or mortality. So let's kind of there are some, almost different ways of thinking about it. So on one hand, you could say no other therapies have improved functional outcomes, right? What would your response be if somebody said, why should andexanet alpha be held to that standard when PCCs, idarucizumab, they haven't shown that improvement, so why should we need to?
And I think it's just kind of what we talked about earlier. When you're the new one coming to town, you have the burden of proof to prove that you're superior to what we were doing before, whether that's right or wrong. But, it's not like we think PCC is an inferior product and we've been waiting so long for something better to come along. Most people think that PCC does a pretty good job of what it's supposed to do, even though it's not specific for what it's reversing. But when you have something that most people think works pretty well, when you're coming in, you better be able to blow them away and show that you have a superior product. And I don't think that's been settled just yet, but a lot of it's bias that we have beforehand, some of the ill will that was created. So, they definitely have the burden of proof to prove that they're better.
And when practice
I agree
gets
with Scott.
changed,
I don't
right?
think it's
Go ahead.
I don't think it's fair, or to be honest, on the balance side of this, I don't think it is actually fair what our standard for this drug has been in terms of the anticipation of it. Like, I don't, and sort of our expectations of what it should do. I think that when you look at it mechanistically, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, does it do it better? I would say no. I'm with Scott in that PCC is not an inferior product, at least in my opinion. It does exactly what we intended it to do. And it's just maybe not fair from that perspective, but with all of the other outside influences of cost and sort of the weird rollout process, it has left a little bit of a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths.
Yeah, I think it also raises questions about, and questions that we never had answers to, is what is the value in terms of outcome of reversing the anticoagulation? And it seems that it is reversing the anticoagulation may be better, but that is not translating into, dramatic differences in the ultimate outcomes that you care about. What is the value of the hematoma volume that's, achieving hemostatic efficacy, as you mentioned, in these patients where their outcome is already really bad and they're going to be in long-term care for a long time, the impact on that ultimate outcome of this thing that was evaluated at 12 hours at presentation, I think it begs the question, what is that? That's a surrogate endpoint that we don't care about directly. We care about it because we think it translates to the downstream things, but what is the relationship between that surrogate marker at 12 hours and the things that we ultimately care about?
Like, it's a risk factor, right? Like, they reference if you meet with any of the AstraZeneca folks, I don't think this is a secret, they'll show you a PowerPoint and share it with you. And they reference 3 studies showing why they kind of chose hemostatic efficacy, why they chose those things. One of them was in the INTERACT-1 sub-analysis, and the other are post-hoc studies from the FAST trial looking at NOVA-7, which is the That's the classic example if we're thinking of changing volumes but not changing outcomes. That was the first one. So the question I always come back to is, we know it is a risk factor. Is it actually a modifiable risk factor? Like, Scott, what was the analogy you referenced in this compared to kind of like the cardiac arrest population? Because I thought it really is a fairly perfect analogy for what I'm feeling with this stuff.
Yeah, we were talking earlier. It's kind of like ROSC and cardiac arrest, and the drug here is epinephrine. Like, you have to get ROSC if you're going to have any improvement in neurostatus, neurofunctions, anything like that. But it actually doesn't translate into any patient-oriented outcomes down the line. I know it's hard because you need one to get the other, but what do you do trying to get the one?
Yeah, I think that is a perfect analogy. And the thing in the trial, the benefit was based on this surrogate endpoint that we're not sure what it means, but the adverse effects were not surrogate endpoints, right? They were things that we definitely care about. What was striking is that the increased thrombotic events were arterial events, things, MI, stroke. If it were just increased risk of DVT, maybe we would think about that differently. But if you're causing more strokes and more MIs, that seems very important.
Especially as we're having an increased interest in long-term outcomes and what happens to them after they leave the ICU, that becomes even more of a point. Brian, I think I cut you off again there.
No, you're good. I think I just wanted to echo what they said and sort of summarize it based off an awesome tweet that Andy Webb had. Essentially, with andexanet alpha, I think you're trading short-term wins for long-term uncertainty.
That's a really good way to say it, because it is that balance of efficacy and safety. And you mentioned surrogate endpoints. The whole reason that we're doing the ANNEXa-I trial is because the initial surrogate, the anti-factor 10A levels, and, we'll toss in a few mailbag questions here. One of the questions we got was, when you look at the supplementary appendix, you'll see that, for example, rivaroxaban may have a higher factor 10A level in the usual care group than the andexanet alpha group. And one of the biggest things that I learned from all of this is that we don't have any correlation with anti-factor 10A levels for hemostatic efficacy. They had low levels when patients came in. Some patients had hemostatic efficacy. Their levels were still high, not even detectable. So, they were initially chosen to be the most relevant, biochemical kind of marker to evaluate anticoag reversal. And it's kind of been scrapped for ETP and thrombin generation, endogenous thrombin potential. That's kind of what you'll hear a lot of the kind of reps and things talk about. Now, the other thing that stood out from some of the folks I talked to, a lot of the people backing andexanet alpha just don't believe in PCC. They don't believe it does anything, and that's why they think that this drug is so important. And that kind of stood out to me. That was from physicians and pharmacists kind of involved on the other side of this. So that's kind of an interesting perspective.
That is them pushing ANNEXa. So their job is to show you that one is inferior to the other, and they're going to say it's non-specific. There's plenty of data that we could get into showing, thrombin generation differences between the two. And so that's their job, is to make the old one say it doesn't work. This is why it doesn't work. We have this new one that does work, and this is why.
Devil's advocate, is that the MSL's job, though?
Exactly. That's 100% their job. That's what they're hired to do, is show you their data and prove to you why the previous data is either lacking or suboptimal or inferior.
The ones that I have talked to feel strongly that is not that is what they hear, and that is not their job, and they're just trying to give you information. I'm only saying this to try to just play both. I'm not trying to contradict everything you're saying, Scott. I'm just trying to make sure both sides are at least being talked about. That's kind of their perspective. I don't necessarily know, right? I'm not in those meetings and things, but that is kind of their side of that coin.
I do think it's a reasonable question to say, what is the effect of PCC? Because we don't have an RCT, a placebo-controlled RCT to say PCC is effective. And that would be really the only way to know that. But we could never do that trial. I mean, I don't know that there would ever be clinical equipoise to support enrollment into that trial. So in some ways, it's a bit of a moot point, because I think often you're going to give something. And so, and PCC's, kind of become the standard of care now.
I mean, they do have some of those trials, but low risk, small bleeds, no deficits, where it's placebo versus PCC. And in a AZ slide deck, they include one of those studies showing that there was no difference in outcomes between placebo and PCC. And so that's them kind of saying that, like, maybe this drug doesn't do anything. But I think it's more of the patients they enrolled are really low risk, small bleeds. So, like, giving something's not going to change anything anyway. But, there are some of these studies that AstraZeneca, are pointing to saying PCC versus placebo, there's no difference.
There's actually an ongoing phase 3 trial with Octapharma looking at their product, Balfaxar, and factor Xa inhibitors. They're primarily looking at dosing of it, 25 versus 50 units per kilo, and it's going to be placebo arm versus the Balfaxar product. So hopefully we get at least a ANNEXa-4 type study with Balfaxar that should be able to hopefully, I think they stopped the trial in February, so hopefully we get something within the next few months, depending on where they're trying to take it. Yeah, I think there's something in the works similar to that for factor Xa inhibitor, quote unquote, reversal.
That's interesting. All right, let's take a quick break, and then Todd's going to come back and talk to us about some of these outstanding statistical questions that are at the top of our minds when we're reading the ANNEXa-I trial. This episode of PharmacyToDose is proudly sponsored by Chiesi. Providing innovative pharmacologic therapies for over 85 years, Chiesi is committed to supporting the clinical pharmacist community and the patients you serve. To learn more, visit chiesi.pharmacytodose.com. All right. And we are joined by, you heard in the introduction, and he is the quote-unquote podcast stats dude. That is a quote-unquote nickname that we got to call our favorite statistician on the show, Todd Miano. And when we're talking about some of these complicated stats that I think some of us have questions about, feels like it means something, but maybe not. So let's call in the expert here. Todd, how are you, man? How's the East Coast? Is it always sunny in Philly right now?
It's sunny. It's great. It's almost too sunny. It's going to be like 98 today. So
I'm out on that. Actually. Yeah. So when we've started, for the listeners to know, I think Todd could probably talk an hour about all the stats that are included in here. We're trying to narrow it down to what we thought are some of our key questions, or things that would help us understand and how to more kind of look at the results and incorporate them. So the first things first, I think, is the p-value change. And how does the recalculation of sample size and the p-value used in the interim analysis, how does that affect our understanding or interpretation of these results, understanding that we stopped the trial early for efficacy as well with this change in the interim power calculation?
So I think this is one of the more important things to think about in interpreting this trial. I think, and it's when you see all these changes, your antenna goes off. You're like, what's going on? Why are they making all these changes? And so I think it's helpful to kind of put yourself in the place of the investigators. So, if you've ever done research, best practice is to plan everything out in advance and think about everything that could possibly happen, and then follow, your plan as closely as possible. And even in observational retrospective research, that's hard to do, right? You try to make the best plan that you do, but then once you get into the data, you find things that you didn't expect and you need to adapt. And it's even more so in prospective research in clinical trials. So you do the best that you can to plan, but then, as they start enrolling patients, they start seeing things. It seems as if they were responding to, new information and realized that our protocol had problems, had weaknesses that we needed to adjust. And it also seems like they received feedback from like regulatory agencies. So I don't, it seems like they were having meetings with the FDA and they were like, well, we don't like the interim analysis thresholds that you proposed. So I think there was some feedback there. But also I think they were responding to new data. So if you look at the original sample size and the data that they were citing, there was a number of observational studies cited estimating the effect of PCC. And that is really the driver. They felt like they were going to see 80% success with their drug based on the prior data. And so it's really what was their estimate for PCC? In the first sample size estimation, they were estimating about 65%. And then, as they started the trial, they started enrolling patients. More studies came out. Some of our colleagues, Morgan Jones' paper in Circulation was a key driver that estimated PCC's efficacy was around 80% in that study. And so I think they realized we have made a mistake, or we're underestimating the potential benefit of PCC. And if that's true, then their original sample size of 440 patients would not be large enough to detect the difference that was actually there. So I think they saw that data and they said, we need to re-estimate our sample size. Now, there is nothing wrong with that if you make those decisions without looking at the results in your study. So that's these changes after we've launched the trial can be problematic and sources of bias if you look at your results and you say, ooh, here's the difference. The difference is not what we thought. Let's change the trial to maximize the difference. That's like data-driven post hoc changes that can be sources of bias and problematic. But if you are enrolling subjects and 3 new studies come out and you realize our projections of the effect of PCC are too low, our trial is going to be underpowered, and an underpowered trial is going to fail, and you adapt to that, that's a reasonable change. So they didn't they didn't propose to change to lower their sample size. More data is always better. So they ended up enrolling more patients, even with the interim analysis, than they had originally proposed to enroll. So I think, and then, beyond the change in the p-values, they list out, seemingly dozens and dozens of changes to the protocol.
Yes.
And which can kind of get your attention. You're like, what's going on here? Is there anything fishy? Why are all these changes? And so you somewhat need to put yourself into the mind of the investigators for what is the rationale for all these changes. But I do think that, as I mentioned, in prospective research, there are always unanticipated things that you need to react to. So these types of changes are going on all the time. And so when you see that list of changes, one take could be, that seems fishy. Why are all the changes? Another take is they are telling us every single thing that they changed. And some of the changes were just like rewording of things. Like not even them, but it didn't even really change what they were doing. It was just how they worded it in the documentation. So I feel comfortable with the information that is presented. And again, whether or not there were motivations for some of those changes, that it's hard to say.
Yeah, that's a he said, she said thing at that point, most of the way, right?
Taking it on its face, seeing the changes that they made, as long as those changes were done without the guidance of looking at the results and letting those guide the changes. If they were, just responding to new information, responding from feedback from people who were enrolling, saying, this protocol is not working, this is a logistical problem, then those types of changes are, can all be above board.
Yeah, I see both sides, right? Because our research and our understanding into the management of ICH in general, right, grew a lot from when they started recruiting or started the study idea till now. On the other side, we know they published 3 separate, cohorts from the same ANNEXa-4 study. So that would make the argument maybe they did looks, right? So we won't necessarily know. Now, with it stopping early, for FCCM, are you more likely to under or overestimate your effect in those cases?
Yeah, so I think with all that being said that we discussed, one key thing to know is that in general, across the board, when a trial is stopped early for benefit, it will tend to overestimate the magnitude, overestimate the effect size. And so that's just across the board. So anytime a trial is enrolling patients and you're estimating a given effect of an intervention, as patients are enrolling, there's random variation around that true effect. It's bouncing up, it's bouncing down. So it's randomly overestimating, randomly underestimating. And so if your stopping criterion is based on a signal of benefit, then that stoppage is most likely to happen when when the effect size is randomly high. So that just generally leads to trial stopped early will overestimate the true underlying benefit. And it's related to smaller sample sizes have more variability than larger sample sizes. And so when a small study has a significant p-value, it means that the effect had to be very large because you have a small sample size. And that signal of effect is a mixture of the true effect and random variation. So smaller sample sizes overestimate effect sizes relative to large sample sizes. So it's kind of that same principle. Now, the magnitude of overestimation, there's debate in terms of how important that is. And it does somewhat relate to the stopping criterions that you use. I don't know that I have a problem with, the particular criteria that they use, that those seemed reasonable. I think for the reader, it's more important to just realize that stopping trials early may overestimate the benefit. So if they would have ended up enrolling all 900 patients, the effect estimate reported in the trial was 12 or 13% difference in hemostatic efficacy. That maybe if we enrolled all 900 patients, it wouldn't have been 12%, it would have been 8%, or, it likely would be somewhat smaller. And you kind of see that in they reported the results of the patients who were accrued at the time that they said, we're going to do the interim analysis today, right? And so they had enrolled 400 and some patients at that time. But then they report the results from all the patients, from the time that they said, we're going to do the enrollment now, or we're going to do the interim analysis today. They had enrolled in another 40 or 50, 60 some patients.
Yeah, I think it was 72. I think I remember right. Something like that.
Yeah. So the final sample size was around 530. And if you look at the effect in that sample size, it was a little bit smaller. It dropped from 12, 13% down to around 11%. So I think you can look at the results, and I think they are legitimate results, just recognizing they may be somewhat of an overestimate.
And being clear for the listener, we're not saying that these are overestimated, findings here. We're just saying we're talking about statistics and probability and talking about likelihood of if you stop early, just kind of generally speaking. So the other big thing that from a kind of statistics thing that stood out to me was they, in the protocol amendments, they changed to using the, apologies in advance when I butchered this name, the Cochran-Mantel-Hansel test, and not like a more simplified test like the Fisher's Exact when they kind of talked about in the beginning. So I know that this is not necessarily true, but I generally err on the KISS method. The more simpler the the statistics, if I understand it, the more likely that this is kind of above board in a sense. But I know that there are very valid statistics tests that I'm just not smart enough to understand. So is this a good reasoning, kind of using this different test from the ones more of us are probably familiar with?
Yeah, so I think the rationale for that change was related to the fact that they changed their randomization scheme. So originally it was just a simple randomization, and then with the protocol change, they shifted to a stratified randomization. So they stratified their randomization by time to treatment, I believe, or it was like a time from a presentation to the scan, or time to the first. Yeah, I think it was time to the first scan, which seems like, it's likely a relevant it's a relevant clinical factor that might affect outcome, right? So, and it's something that, especially in smaller sample sizes, even though you have a randomized trial, over time, there can be chance imbalances, especially when you're doing interim looks, right? So we're going to randomize 900 patients, but we're going to look early. And at that early time point, there may have not been enough patients randomized for everything to balance out perfectly. So one way to account for that is to stratify your randomization. So, and what that means is, instead of just each person that shows up, I flip a coin. It's each person shows up, and then I say, what was your time to presentation? Was it above or below? And then I have a separate coin flip that is kind of matched on that stratification factor. And so what it does is it ensures balance on that factor. So now you have a stratifying randomization, and your statistical analysis needs to account for that randomization. A chi-square test is an overall test, and there aren't versions of the chi or the Fisher's exact that are stratified. So the Cochran-Mantel-Hansel is a test for yes/no outcomes that can be stratified. You can think of it as like adjustment. So instead of this Cochran-Mantel-Hansel, you could have done a logistic regression where you adjust for the stratification factor. So what that test is doing is adjusting for the stratification, which is appropriate. So I think that was the rationale for the change.
Todd, thanks for trying to help us make sense of these statistics. It's always good to have the perspective of somebody much smarter than us in this field to help us understand that. And you clarified a lot of it, that a lot of it there is real theory and logic behind it. And even though I think on the surface it may look questionable having all these changes, I think that's a really good perspective that you had of it's probably not all in that sense. There's probably some, X, Y, or Z happening. So always appreciate you coming on and shedding light, my friend. We appreciate you, man. Thanks.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Scott, Brian, and Todd. Remember, this is part 1, part 2 coming shortly. But appreciate everybody. You heard their Twitter handles at the beginning, but just in case you forgot, at Gilbert PharmD, at PCC_PharmD, and at Miano81, at PharmacyToDose on the social medias. Remember, go to the YouTube channel to see the full video of this. It's really cool. We got, when we're talking and referencing a study or something, we're able to put it right next to us, so it makes it a really cool visual. Reach out to me. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns. PharmacyToDose.com is the website, or an old-fashioned email, PharmacyToDose@gmail.com. But until next time, I'm Nick Peters, and this is Pharmacy to Dose, the Critical Care Podcast. The Critical Care PRN optimizes drug therapy outcomes by promoting excellence and innovation in clinical pharmacy practice, research, and education. For more information, go to critprn.accp.com. Again, that is critprn.accp.com. The podcast provides general information only and does not offer individualized medical or professional healthcare services, including pharmaceutical advice. The contents and materials in the podcast are not intended to be a substitute for inpatient pharmaceutical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Use of the contents and materials in the podcast does not constitute a pharmacist-patient relationship. As a result, the information in and materials linked to this podcast are applied at the user or patient's own risk. Users and patients should consult their physician or personal healthcare professional. The user or patient should not ignore or delay seeking care because of something they heard on this podcast. In case of an emergency, the user or patient should contact their physician, call 911, or go to the nearest medical emergency facility. The views and statements expressed on this podcast are those of the host and guests and should not be interpreted to reflect the official position or policy of ACCP or the Critical Care PRN. ACCP and the Critical Care PRN disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or any other damages, including without limitation, loss of profits arising out of any use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast, its contents, and materials.